So I'm going to explain my favorite study technique that I came up with. And I'm first just going to get to the point and demonstrate it. And then after that, I'll go into the detail and the theory behind it and everything. So you can watch that part if you're interested. So I call it the shapes. And there's a yin yang. This is the foundational shape. This is the most important. Then there's the triangle. And then there's the square. So it's basically just a technique that allows me to apply the principle of chunking, which is a thing in learning science where you categorize things. But the reason I like to use this specifically is because having a specific technique like this forces me to chunk things effectively and to also compare and contrast them. So the most important shape is the yin yang. So I'm going to start with that one. The idea here is just constantly creating yin yangs for everything that I come across in material. So what it allows me to do is it helps me to learn things in relation to one another instead of in isolation. And that's the thing in learning science is that when you learn things as isolated facts, it's a lot harder to remember them, you're more likely to forget. But if you learn them in connection to other things, then that one thing serves as a kind of memory anchor to help you remember the other thing. And you also just understand it better because part of what defines what something is what it's not. So even if we look at the yin yang itself and I say, this side represents the color white. Well, what is white? It's not black, right? Just like black is all the colors of the rainbow put together, white is the absence of color. So if I think of like something that you would study in school or something like that, let's say just a random thing that comes to mind, habituation versus sensitization. Now, if somebody teaches me the term habituation, it basically means when over time you have less response to a stimulus. It's like a psychology concept because your neurology concept because your neurotransmitters your neurons release less neurotransmitter each time you receive the stimulus. The more you keep doing it, basically you're getting used to it. It's becoming a habit. So you just get used to it and you don't really react anymore. Versus to be sensitized to something means you have more response to that stimulus. The more it's administered to you. Right? So these things are obviously a pair. And just being aware of that. Now, something like this will be probably presented as a pair. So that makes it easier. But some things, a lot of times you'll find things that are pairs and should be presented as pairs, but maybe they're not. So if you're always looking for those pairs, then it just makes it easier to understand things. So the next up is the triangle. Now, I said the yin yang was the foundational shape that this whole technique is based on. Why? Because the yin yang is the simplest and most fundamental relationship you can have. I had a social psychology professor in college who was really great, and he would ask us on the first day of class each year, he would say, what's the fundamental unit of social psychology? It's social because it's all about relationships. So the fundamental unit was, he would say, the dyad, which di just means two. So it just means a relationship between two people. So what I'm trying to get across here is that the yin yang is the most simplistic, way you can demonstrate a relationship between two ideas. So if you want all of your learning to be relational and you want all the ideas that you learn to be connected to one another, the yin yang is like the most simple, fundamental tool that you can use to do that. So this shape is the foundation of all of the other ones that I'm going to show. Okay, so with that being said, this is a triangle, right? So I draw like a triangle and then an upside down triangle inside of it so that you have three parts. And basically, I draw the triangle automatically if I'm ever given a list of three things or a group of three things I need to memorize or know or whatever in med school. So the yin yang is 2. If you have three themes, you use the triangle. Okay, I keep not getting to my point about the yin yang, which is that the triangle is just a yin yang with an extra part on top. Okay, so the triangle is a yin yang with an odd man out, is how I like to say it. So one example I always like to use, because it was a really nice triangle I made in the first block, and I still remembered it, like, you know, at the end of the block and then at the end of the next block, partially because it was such a nice triangle and partially because I always use it as an example when I talk about this. So it's kind of like cheating now in that way. But anyways, I'm going to use it. We were learning about rapidly replicating, we were learning about a DNA replication disease, right? So I was talking to somebody and they mentioned how I was looking for a reason why, which is really important when you're learning things, to have a reason why, because it makes it easier to remember. So I was looking for a reason why, and the person told me, it's DNA replication diseases. So it affects things that are rapidly dividing, cells that are rapidly dividing, because they need a lot. They obviously have to use DNA replication more frequently than other cells. So those cell types were skin and keratin. So we were given these three diseases, and I put them in this triangle where two of them were keratin related and one of them was skin related. Because these two are keratin related, they made a pair. Whereas the one that was skin related was the odd man out. They're both rapidly dividing cells, so I can remember that these were DNA replication disorders. Okay, so one of them was dyskeratosis congenita. I remember that because, again, my triangle was skin or keratin as the yin yang and then skin as the odd man out. My triangle was keratin as the yin yang, as the pair, and then skin as the odd man out. So dyskeratosis obviously has keratin in the name, congenital bad keratin, and then the other one was idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Now to make that work, I had to look that up because, again, I was looking for my reason why, and I found out that it's idiopathic, meaning we don't know the cause of the disease, but the research is kind of pointing towards the idea that it's a keratin problem. So that made it work perfectly with my shape here. So once I found that out, I put these two guys as a pair, and then I can remember that the third guy was Bloom's syndrome because that's a skin problem. It's a big rash that blooms right in front of the person's face in the shape of a butterfly. So I'm being very verbose here, and I said I was going to get to the point and then give detail after. That did not really happen, so sorry about that. But what I was trying to demonstrate here is that I'm able to remember this thing. I would not remember all of these things off the top of my head because it was a long time ago and it wasn't really the biggest deal ever as far as what we were learning. But I can remember it now after all that time because I have this relationship here and this relationship here, right? So these two guys relate to each other as a pair. They have something in common. They're in the same chunk, keratin. And then these guys as a whole chunk relate to this guy because he's the odd man out. He's the only one that has to do with skin rather than keratin. So just this simple like exercise of as soon as I'm giving three items, I draw the shape and then I look for a way that I can fit them in it. It forces me to look for relationships and to find and uncover the relationships that exist between these things. Now that I have that relationship, it makes it so much easier to remember it because I don't have to remember all of these words when I think about DNA replication disorders. Instead, I can just remember DNA replication will affect rapidly dividing cells, which are these two guys, skin and keratin, right? Cells that kind of slough off, die away, and get replaced constantly. You're constantly shedding your skin, you're constantly shedding your hair and your fingernails and stuff like that. So it's like, all I have to do is remember when I'm given the word DNA replication, all I have to do is remember these two guys, and then I can work out everything else from that because of the triangle. So that's kind of the technique on display. Now the final of the three shapes is the square. So if I'm given four things, I do a square. Now remember, the triangle was just a yin-yang with an odd man out, right? It's the same thing for the square. The yin-yang is always the foundation of all of this. So a square, maybe you can try and guess what it's going to be. It's basically two yin-yangs, right? It's two yin-yangs, but then those yin-yangs are also yin-yang with each other, right? So I want to think of an example. I should have come up with examples before I started recording this. So for instance, let's say I'm given a list of 4 diseases that I need to remember in relation to each other and know they're all a certain type of disease or whatever. One of them, let's say, affects the central nervous system. So let's just say, we'll say it affects the brain. One of them affects the nerves in the peripheral nervous system. One of them affects the heart. And one of them affects blood vessels. Now, the way I've written it here, it's kind of obvious the association. Maybe it's presented to you as you're learning it in a more scrambled order, right? Like that, right? So the blood, CNS, PNS, and the heart. Well, if as soon as I'm given these 4 diseases, I automatically draw my square, now it puts me in a frame of mind where I'm looking for the opportunity for chunking, for association, and to basically compare and contrast things and group them into pairs, right? So we get the chunking aspect. It makes us automatically start chunking, and it makes us automatically start looking for how things contrast with each other, how they relate to each other, what makes this rather than that. So if I'm given these diseases, once I draw my square, I'm likely to realize, because it puts me in that frame of mind, right? Okay, this is cardiovascular stuff, and this is nervous system stuff, right? So I do a lightning bolt for nervous system and this thing for cardiovascular, heart, blood vessel, anything blood or vascular, I use that symbol. And I like to use a lot of these symbols in my notes so I don't have to spend time writing out words. It just makes things a lot easier to write, easier to read, everything's quicker, makes things visual. But what I'm demonstrating here is that I just put a yin-yang of this, CNS versus PNS, right? A yin-yang of this. This one affects heart, while this one specifically affects the blood vessels, even though they're both cardiovascular. So what I do with the square is, since it's a square, it's all one shape. But since it's actually 2 yin-yangs put together, after I make it, I'll put I'll make one of the lines bolder to make that separation, right? So it's I'm comparing CNS versus PNS and cardio versus vascular, but I'm also comparing nervous versus cardiovascular. Let's say I'm given a list of 5 things. What would I do? Right, so it can just be the square with an odd man out again. So similar thing as the triangle. The triangle was 1 pair, 1 yin-yang with an odd man out. This is 2 yin-yangs with an odd man out, so pretty straightforward. Or I can do a triangle and a yin-yang. And I know it sounds like I'm explaining really basic math here. It might sound kind of silly, but it's really just about showing the different possibilities and how the tool can force you to look at things in a way that you might not otherwise. So if I'm given 5 things, instead of memorizing the list and trying to make it work and make things difficult, if I immediately draw a shape, it puts me in a frame of mind where I'm automatically grouping them now, and it makes things a lot more easy and intuitive to remember. Depending on what the things are, that's what determines which of these you would use, right? Let's say it actually is 2 pairs, right? Let's say I'm giving these 4 diseases: CNS disease, PNS disease, a cardio disease, a vascular disease, and then a respiratory disease, right? Then I would do it like this. I would just use the square and add the odd man out. Why? Because this guy is not this guy's not cardiovascular and that's why I usually write the name of the pair on the side, but he's not cardiovascular or nervous, right? If it's some random thing. But let's say that that fifth disease was, a venous disease, right? Okay, well now it makes more sense for me to organize the 5 like this, not using the square with an odd man out, but instead using a triangle and a yin yang. Right, so now I've broken the 5 into 2 groups, 2 separate shapes. So I got the nervous guys over here, and then I have the cardiovascular over here. I use, just to clarify, I use this for veins, and then I use this for arteries or blood or vascular stuff in general. So you can see here, I put the heart up here, not like down here, because these are both vascular. It's just 2 opposite, keyword opposite, types of vascular. So you can see again, our triangle is a yin yang with an odd man out. And the really cool thing is you don't necessarily have to once you start doing it, you'll realize you don't have to really try to make this work. Rather, it's kind of like everything is already set up like this, but you just don't notice it until you start trying to put it into shapes. So it's really cool how as you're doing it, even just the act of drawing it in will make you realize, oh, this whole thing kind of does have a pattern to it, even though I would have not thought so at first glance. So let's say we have 6, right? And really, again, I'm not going to go on forever in terms of numbers because it's just these 3, right? But I'm just showing the variations of how it can be used. Like with the 4, technically it's kind of a different shape because you added on the bottom category. But yeah, anyways, let's say you have 6. What would I do? You can probably guess it. I do 2 triangles, right? But then again, depending on how, what the nature of the themes in the list are, I might instead do this. So it's a square with a yin yang underneath, right? Or you could just say 3 yin yangs. I don't like to do this triple box thing though. I like to use the square and then the pair. So then you have boom, boom, right? You'll have 2 pairs that are really closely related or direct opposites, or they're in the same group, right? So they're either very opposite or very similar. Then you'll have this odd pair out, which again is basically just this, but I prefer to draw it like that because it just fits together better. Or it could be 2 groups of 3, right? Which will each have a pair and an odd man out. And the great thing about it is, I don't know if I made this clear, the idea with the shapes is that when you remember one thing, it automatically triggers you. Well, let's start with the yin yang, right? If you have a yin yang and you remember one of the things in the yin yang, right? Something triggers you to remember it. You automatically remember the other one because it's the opposite, because you created that opposite relationship, or not created, you noticed the opposite relationship. Or sometimes you have to be creative and create it, just to help make things easier to remember. So if I remember, habituation, it makes you less likely to respond to things. It's almost impossible to not remember, right? If I've recognized the relationship between them and and learned them as a group instead of in isolation, it's now impossible not to remember what the other one is, because it's literally just the opposite. If you know the definition of yes, you automatically know the definition of no, right? If you know the definition of more, you automatically know the definition of less, because less just means the opposite of more, So it's anyway, this is the basis of logical thinking, right? It's just about true or false, yes or no, 1 or 0, right? So I really like this tool because it allows me to break things down. It kind of forces me to put things into groups, recognize the relationships I might have overlooked or probably would have not noticed, and just break things down into simple logic. So it's very great as a memory tool because of that, right? Because I'm talking about relationships and groups and all these things, and I mean, there's lots of benefits to it, but the main thing I'm talking about now is that it makes things easier to remember. So kind of like with this triangle, what happened here was I remembered this one first. I usually do. Why? Because it has keratin in the name. So it's easy for me to remember that's part of the keratin pair. Only after I remember this one, I know that there's another one in the keratin pair, and that's what triggers me to remember that one. Then now that I got these two guys, I remember that they were opposed to a skin disease, and then I remember this one. So it makes it so that each item in the list is actively triggering your memory of the other items, right? So it's almost like once you remember one, the work is now made easy for you. You don't even have to remember the other ones. You get automatically reminded of them. Yeah, so that's the idea. That's the idea behind it. And now with the yin yangs, I might talk about this more in a different video. But I won't always draw a yin yang out, right? What you might be typing, or you might just not want to spend the time to draw it. I will draw them like sometimes quick like that in my notes, just because it stands out. And I like to see when I'm taking notes, if I see that big symbol on the page at some point, when I'm reviewing the notes, my eye will automatically go there because I know that's a relationship. You know, I know that's a juicy relationship and piece of information that will help me understand things better. So I like to draw them a lot of the time on my notes, but sometimes I'll just put in verses. I'll just write this versus that, right? Habituation versus sensitization. I guess it's, it's the same idea, right? Because it's not about how you're drawing it and everything. It's just that mindset of looking for contrasting relationships between things, putting things in pairs and putting things in contrast to one another. So that's pretty much it. That's the little thing I do in my note taking that I find really helpful. And so I like to tell people about it because it's very cool and very helpful. So yeah, that's it. So, the idea of comparing and contrasting things as you're learning is not really the most revolutionary idea ever. Actually, it's one of the main things that the literature will advise you to do when you're learning about learning science and things like that. But the reason I talk about this tool as a specific way of doing that is that it forces you to execute those principles in your learning without having to actually think about it and remind yourself to do it. You just say, anytime I'm given a group of things, I'm drawing the shape that corresponds to that number of things, Or anytime I'm learning something, I'm always trying to put it into yin yangs rather than just writing the themes down, in a list or whatever. So I really like it because it's like the tool does the work for you. As long as you use it, you automatically begin to see things in this related sort of way.